She thought love could conquer anything. Until the night she overheard the man she loved tell his mother that marrying her would be a liability. Sienna Blackwell grew up believing in the power of hard work, integrity, and staying true to yourself. On the south side of Chicago, in a tight-knit Black community where everyone knew your name and your grandmother's cornbread recipe, she learned what real success looked like. It wasn't about the money. It was about the strength you carried in your bones, the kind of strength her mother talked about while working double shifts as a nurse to put Sienna through college. "Baby, don't ever let anyone make you feel small," her mother would say, words that became armor as Sienna navigated the gleaming towers of corporate America. By 28, Sienna had built something remarkable. An MBA from Howard University, a thriving career as a marketing consultant for Fortune 500 companies, close friendships with her sorority sisters who'd been there through every triumph and heartbreak. She volunteered at the same community center where she'd grown up, giving back to the neighborhood that had given her everything. Her life was full, purposeful, on her own terms. And then she met Garrett Lancaster and everything changed. It happened at one of those stiff corporate networking events in downtown Chicago. Champagne, small talk, and forced smiles. Sienna normally avoided them like the plague, but her firm was courting a major client, so she showed up in her best business attire, natural curls styled in an elegant updo, ready to make connections she'd probably forget by morning. That's when she noticed him. Not because he was loud or flashy, but because people orbited around him like he was the sun. Garrett Lancaster, 32 years old, CEO of Lancaster Technologies, a company his father had founded but that Garrett had transformed into a billion-dollar empire. Tall, sandy blonde hair, sharp blue eyes, and that easy confidence that comes from never having to prove your worth to anyone. Their first real conversation happened on the balcony when Sienna stepped outside for air. Garrett appeared beside her, loosening his tie with visible relief. "These things are exhausting," he said, his voice warm and genuine. She was surprised by how normal he seemed, how human. They talked for over an hour that night, not about quarterly earnings or market projections, but about real things. Garrett spoke about the pressure of living up to his family's legacy, of being dismissed as just a trust fund kid despite working 80-hour weeks. Sienna shared her own battles, being one of the few Black women in executive meetings, constantly having to be twice as good to be seen as half as competent, the exhaustion of code switching between worlds. "You know what I admire about you?" Garrett said as the evening wound down. "You don't apologize for who you are. Everyone in there is wearing a mask. But you're authentic." That authenticity became the foundation of their relationship. For 2 years, Sienna and Garrett built something beautiful, a collision of two completely different worlds learning to coexist. He introduced her to charity galas at the Art Institute, weekend trips to his family's estate in Lake Forest, exclusive restaurants where waiters knew his preferences by heart. It was a world of privilege and old money, where conversations revolved around portfolios and country club memberships. But Garrett didn't just want Sienna to fit into his world. He wanted to understand hers too. She brought him to Sunday dinners at her grandmother's house, where he learned to appreciate the depth of Black family bonds, the way everyone looked out for each other, the resilience passed down through generations. He attended her cousin's baby shower in the neighborhood, a cookout where he was the only white face but was welcomed with warmth and good-natured teasing. "You better take care of our girl," Sienna's uncle told him while flipping burgers on the grill. "She's special." "I know she is," Garrett replied, and in that moment Sienna believed him. They supported each other's dreams fiercely. When Sienna decided to launch her own consulting firm focusing on diversity and inclusion, Garrett was her first investor and biggest cheerleader. When Garrett faced a hostile takeover attempt, Sienna stayed up nights helping him strategize, bringing her sharp marketing mind to his defense. They talked about marriage, about children, about the beautiful blended family they would create together. Their intimate moments were filled with genuine connection, late-night conversations about their future, quiet mornings planning the life they'd build, passionate embraces that seemed to bridge any cultural divide. But love doesn't exist in a vacuum. And as their relationship deepened, the cracks began to show. Garrett's family had always been polite to Sienna, but polite isn't the same as accepting. His mother, Constance Lancaster, was a pillar of Chicago's high society. Old money, old values, and very old ideas about who belonged in their world. The comments started subtly, like poison disguised as concern. "Oh, Sienna, you're so articulate. Where did you go to school again? Howard? How interesting. Garrett, darling, have you thought about how difficult things might be for mixed children?" Garrett always defended Sienna in the moment, but she noticed something crucial. He never confronted his family about their microaggressions. The conversations happened, the hurt accumulated, and slowly, a wedge formed between them. At Lancaster Technologies, things were even worse. The board members, mostly older white men who'd known Garrett's father, made it brutally clear they didn't approve of the CEO's relationship. They questioned Sienna's influence on Garrett's business decisions, whispered that she was a gold digger trying to access the family fortune, suggested that this distraction was affecting his leadership. The pressure mounted from every direction. Garrett became withdrawn, defensive, distant. And Sienna? She felt herself shrinking, constantly having to prove her worth, exhausted from fighting battles on every front. In his world, and sometimes even in her own community, where some questioned why she was with a white man when there were good black men available. Then came the night that shattered everything. Garrett's father was retiring, and the family hosted an elegant dinner to celebrate his legacy. Sienna wore a stunning dress, smiled at all the right people, and tried to ignore the way Constance Lancaster looked through her like she was invisible. Halfway through the evening, Sienna stepped into the hallway to catch her breath when she heard voices coming from the study. Garrett and his mother. "Son, you have a responsibility to this family, to the company," Constance said, her voice sharp with urgency. "Marrying her would be a liability. The board will never fully accept it. Your father built this legacy for you. Don't throw it away for whatever this is." Sienna stood frozen, waiting, praying, for Garrett to defend their love, to stand up for what they'd built together, to choose her. But the silence stretched too long, too heavy, too telling. That night, Garrett drove her home in crushing quiet. At her door, he finally spoke the words that would break her heart. "Maybe we need to take a break, just to think about things." "A break?" Sienna's voice cracked. "Garrett, we've been talking about marriage. What is there to think about?" "It's complicated, Sienna. My family, the business, the timing." "The timing?" She felt tears burning behind her eyes. "Or is it that I'm not the right type for the Lancaster legacy? That's not fair, isn't it?" She looked at the man she loved, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. "You love me when we're alone, but you won't fight for me when it matters." "I do love you, but not enough." She opened her door, her heart shattering into 1,000 pieces. "I deserve someone who loves me enough to choose me, publicly, proudly, without apologies." And just like that, 2 years of love, of building a life together, of believing they could bridge any divide. It all crumbled because Garrett Lancaster chose comfort over courage. But here's the question that haunted Sienna as she walked away that night, the question that would change everything. What do you do when the person you loved reduces you to a liability, and you're holding a secret that could destroy everything they've built? 6 months after walking away from Garrett Lancaster, Sienna Blackwell told herself she'd moved on. She threw herself into building her consulting firm, surrounded herself with her sorority sisters who reminded her of her worth, and showed up to Sunday dinners at her grandmother's house where extra plates of comfort food came with zero judgment. She even started dating again, successful black professionals who understood her world without explanation, men who didn't need a tutorial on microaggressions or code switching. She was healing. She was thriving. She was fine. She was lying to herself. Because healing isn't linear, and sometimes the universe has a cruel sense of timing. The news broke on a Tuesday morning while Sienna was reviewing a client proposal. Her phone buzzed with a text from her best friend Maya. "Girl, I'm so sorry. Check the Tribune." There it was, splashed across the society pages in elegant font and professional photography. Garrett Lancaster engaged to Clarissa Worthington, daughter of the prominent Worthington banking family. The announcement read like a merger agreement, 2 wealthy white families joining forces, old money meeting older money. Exactly the kind of union that would make the Lancaster Technologies board smile with approval. The photo showed Garrett and Clarissa at some charity function, her hand displaying a diamond so large it could be seen from space, his arm wrapped around her waist with the kind of ease that felt like a slap across Sienna's face. Clarissa was everything Sienna wasn't. Blonde, thin, from the right families, safe, approved, and from the glowing quote from Constance Lancaster in the article, absolutely adored by his mother. Sienna stared at that photo for longer than she'd ever admit, and something twisted in her chest. Not jealousy exactly, something worse. The feeling of being erased, replaced, upgraded like an outdated phone model. She told herself it didn't hurt. She told herself she'd dodged a bullet. She told herself Garrett had done her a favor by showing his true colors before she'd wasted more years on a man who couldn't choose her when it mattered. But late that night, alone in her apartment with a glass of wine she didn't finish, Sienna let herself feel the truth. It hurt. God, it hurt. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that the pain was just beginning. The cruelty started at a charity gala 3 months later, an event Sienna attended for work. Her firm had been hired to consult on diversity initiatives for the hosting organization, and she'd decided it was time to show the world that Sienna Blackwell was thriving. She looked absolutely stunning that night, a form-fitting emerald gown that celebrated every curve, her natural hair styled in beautiful goddess locks that cascaded down her back, her brown skin glowing with the kind of confidence that comes from surviving heartbreak and choosing yourself anyway. She was networking with potential clients, laughing at the right moments, making connections, doing what she did best. Then Garrett walked in with Clarissa on his arm, and the air shifted. Sienna could have handled seeing them together. She'd prepared herself for that inevitable moment. What she couldn't prepare for was what happened next. The moment that would transform her hurt into something far more dangerous. She was standing near a marble column, discussing a potential contract with the CEO, when Garrett's voice carried across the room. He was with a group of his business associates, and they clearly didn't realize she was within earshot. Or maybe they did. Maybe that was the point. Honestly, I'm relieved it ended when it did. Garrett was saying, his tone casual, dismissive, like he was discussing a business deal that hadn't panned out. It was fun, different, but there's something to be said for being with someone who understands your world. Clarissa just fits. My family adores her. The board approves. Everything's easier. One of his friends laughed. That particular brand of wealthy white male laughter that sounds like breaking glass. So the diversity experiment is over? The pause before Garrett's response felt like an eternity. Then he laughed along, the sound driving a knife straight through Sienna's chest. Let's just say I learned some valuable lessons about the importance of compatibility. Sienna felt the blood drain from her face. Her hands went cold despite the warmth of the ballroom. 2 years of her life. The Sunday dinners she'd brought him to, the vulnerable conversations at 3 in the morning, the way she'd stood beside him during his company crisis, the future they'd planned, the love she'd given freely. All of it reduced to an experiment, a diversity checkbox, a learning experience, something he'd outgrown like a college phase. The CEO she'd been talking to was still speaking, but Sienna couldn't hear him over the ringing in her ears. She excused herself with practiced grace, walked to the bathroom on steady legs that felt like they might buckle, and stared at her reflection in the mirror. That woman looking back at her, beautiful, accomplished, worthy, had just been publicly diminished to a character in Garrett Lancaster's journey of self-discovery. But that was just the beginning. Over the following months, Garrett seemed to go out of his way to showcase his perfect new life, and Sienna couldn't escape it. They moved in the same professional circles, attended the same industry events, existed in overlapping worlds that made avoidance impossible. His social media, which she'd blocked but friends kept sending her screenshots of anyway, showed him and Clarissa at events Sienna used to attend with him. The Art Institute galas, the charity functions, even that little Italian restaurant in River North where he'd first told Sienna he was falling in love with her. Industry publications ran features on Garrett's engagement, with quotes about how his personal life had brought stability to his leadership, as if loving Sienna had been some kind of chaotic mistake that needed correcting. At a tech conference where both their companies were represented, Sienna watched from across the room as Garrett introduced Clarissa to colleagues with enthusiastic warmth, animated hand gestures, genuine smiles. The kind of public pride he'd never quite managed when Sienna stood beside him. When he saw Sienna at that same conference, he offered a polite nod. Distant, professional, like she was a former business associate he vaguely remembered. The message couldn't have been clearer if he'd taken out a billboard. Sienna had been replaced, upgraded, forgotten. But the worst, the absolute worst, came at an industry award ceremony where Sienna was being honored for her groundbreaking work in diversity consulting. She'd built her firm into something remarkable, was making real change in corporate America, was being recognized for excellence in her field. It should have been a triumph. Instead, it became the night that changed everything. During the cocktail hour before the ceremony, Sienna was standing near the bar when she heard a familiar voice. Clarissa's, sweet as poisoned honey, holding court with a group of other corporate wives. "Oh, I know all about her," Clarissa said, and Sienna's entire body went still. "She dated Garrett before me. Honestly, I think he was just trying to prove he wasn't prejudiced. You know how these tech CEOs are, they want to seem progressive, especially after all that scrutiny about diversity in Silicon Valley. But when it came time for something serious, something lasting, well," she paused for effect, raising her left hand to display that massive diamond ring. "He chose someone appropriate." The women around Clarissa laughed, that particular brand of wealthy white woman laughter that sounds like wind chimes made of cruelty. They nodded knowingly, exchanged glances that said they understood exactly what appropriate meant. And Garrett was standing less than 10 feet away, close enough to hear every word. Close enough to see Sienna's face as his fiancée reduced their entire relationship to a performative act of progressive posturing. Close enough to do something, say something, defend the woman he'd once claimed to love. He did nothing. He looked uncomfortable for perhaps 3 seconds, then turned to join a different conversation, leaving Clarissa's words hanging in the air like smoke from a fire he'd started but refused to extinguish. Sienna walked out of that ceremony with her head held high, accepted her award with grace and professionalism, delivered her speech without a tremor in her voice. But inside, she was screaming. Inside, something fundamental was breaking and reforming into something new, something harder, something that understood a truth she'd been avoiding. Garrett Lancaster had never truly valued her. Not as a partner, not as a person. She'd been a performance, a way for him to feel enlightened and open-minded before returning to the comfort of what his family expected. That night, alone in her apartment with the awards sitting on her coffee table, Sienna felt the hurt begin its transformation. Pain turned to clarity. Humiliation turned to determination. Because there was something Garrett didn't know. Something she'd kept private out of respect for what they'd shared, out of the integrity her grandmother had taught her, out of the belief that some confidences were sacred. But respect is a two-way street. And Garrett had shown he had absolutely none for her. The secret had been shared on a night about a year into their relationship, after making love in Garrett's penthouse apartment. They'd been lying in that vulnerable quiet that follows deep intimacy. Their bodies tangled in expensive sheets, moonlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. Garrett had been unusually quiet, his fingers tracing absent patterns on Sienna's shoulder. "There's something I've never told anyone," he'd whispered into the darkness. "Something about the company, about my father's legacy." Sienna had turned to face him, seen the turmoil in his eyes. "You can tell me anything." And he had. "My father didn't build Lancaster Technologies alone," Garrett confessed, his voice barely audible. "He had a business partner in the early days, Preston Hayes, a brilliant black man who developed most of the core technology that became our foundation. The algorithms, the frameworks, the innovations that made us billions, they were Preston's. But when they were about to go public, when the real money was about to come in, my father pushed him out." "What do you mean, pushed him out?" Sienna had asked, though she already knew. She'd heard variations of this story too many times. Brilliant black innovators erased from their own creations. Bought him out for pennies on the dollar of what his stake would be worth. Threatened him with lawsuits he couldn't afford to fight. Preston didn't have the resources for a legal battle against the Lancaster family lawyers. So he took what little he could get and disappeared. Garrett's voice cracked. My entire legacy, everything this company is built on, it was stolen. We're tech industry royalty because my father committed theft wrapped in legal documents and racial power dynamics. Garrett, that's horrible, Sienna had said, her heart breaking for Preston Hayes, for every black innovator whose genius had been stolen by people with more power and fewer scruples. I know. I found out about 3 years ago when I was going through old company files. Documents my father kept locked away. I've been trying to track Preston down ever since, to make it right somehow, to give him what he's owed. But I don't know where he is, and if the board finds out I'm looking, if this becomes public knowledge. He'd looked at her with something like desperation. Could destroy everything. The stock price, the company reputation, my family's legacy. You could do the right thing now, Sienna had said gently, even as part of her already knew what his response would be. Find him. Give him what he's owed. Make it right. I want to. I'm trying. But it's complicated. It was always complicated for Garrett when doing the right thing threatened his comfort. Sienna had held him that night, believing in his intention to eventually make things right, trusting that the man she loved would find the courage to choose justice over convenience. And even after their relationship ended, even after he broke her heart, she'd kept his secret, because that's who Sienna Blackwell was, a woman of integrity who kept her word even when it cost her. But now, sitting in her apartment with Clarissa's words still echoing in her mind, he chose someone appropriate. Sienna understood something crucial. The secret Garrett had shared wasn't just his burden to carry. It was Preston Hayes' story to tell, Preston Hayes' justice delayed for 30 years, Preston Hayes' genius erased from history so the Lancaster family could build an empire on stolen ground. Keeping that secret wasn't loyalty to Garrett. It was complicity in an injustice that had been buried for decades. And Sienna was done being complicit. But here's the thing about exposing a secret that could destroy a billionaire. You can't just throw accusations into the wind and hope they stick. You need evidence. You need proof. You need an airtight case that can withstand the full force of Lancaster family lawyers and their unlimited resources. Most importantly, you need to find the man whose life was stolen and make sure that whatever happens next serves his justice, not your revenge. So Sienna began to dig. She used every skill she'd developed as a consultant specializing in corporate ethics and diversity. She leveraged her network, the professors from Howard who'd taught her research methodology, the lawyers in her sorority who understood corporate malfeasance, the investigative journalists she'd worked with on diversity initiatives. She requested public documents, business filings, old partnership agreements. She searched for any trace of Preston Hayes in the digital age, following threads that led nowhere until finally, she found him. Preston Hayes was living in Atlanta, running a small tech repair shop in a strip mall between a nail salon and a tax preparation office. His brilliant mind, the mind that had created innovations worth billions, was being used to fix cracked iPhone screens and troubleshoot router problems for $35 an hour. Sienna reached out carefully, sending an email that explained who she was, how she knew about him, and what she wanted to do. She expected suspicion, maybe anger, possibly rejection. What she got was a phone call 3 days later, Preston's voice heavy with the weight of decades. I've been telling my truth for 30 years, he said quietly. But who listens to a black man with no money when he's going up against the Lancaster empire? Who believes the nobody over the billionaire family? They'll listen now, Sienna promised, because I have proof, and I have a platform, and I have nothing left to lose. When they met in person, Sienna flying to Atlanta on a weekend, sitting across from Preston in a small coffee shop where he seemed almost afraid to hope, she showed him everything. The documents Garrett had showed her during their relationship, photographs she'd taken of financial records during vulnerable nights when trust meant sharing everything, even the recordings she'd made of their conversations. Not for evidence, but because she'd been keeping a relationship journal, documenting their story because she'd believed it would have a happy ending. Preston's hands shook as he looked through the evidence. Tears rolled down his face. Not just sadness, but rage, vindication, relief. This is everything I tried to tell people. Everything they said I couldn't prove. You can prove it now, Sienna said. Together, over the next several weeks, They built a case that would be impossible to deny. Financial records showing the original partnership structure. Technical documentation proving Preston's innovations in his own hand, time-stamped and dated. Emails and internal memos from Lancaster Sr. that made the theft explicit. Phrases like, minimize Hayes' stake before going public, and draft termination agreement that limits future claims. Patent applications with Preston's name mysteriously removed in later filings. And yes, that recorded conversation where Garrett admitted the whole truth, his voice vulnerable in the darkness, confessing sins he'd inherited but chose to perpetuate. Sienna had never intended to use that recording. But intention shifts when someone shows you they never valued you at all, when they mock your love while building their happiness on foundations of lies and stolen valor. She partnered with an investigative journalist from a major publication, a woman who'd built her career on exposing corporate malfeasance and who saw in this story something bigger than one company's fraud. A pattern of how Black innovators had been systematically erased from American technological history. The exposé was scheduled to drop 2 weeks before Garrett's wedding to Clarissa Worthington. The timing wasn't about revenge, though Sienna would be lying if she said there wasn't a certain poetry to it. The timing was strategic. Maximum visibility, maximum impact, maximum chance that Preston Hayes would finally get the justice he'd been denied for 3 decades. As the publication date approached, Sienna lay awake at night wrestling with the weight of what she was about to do. Was this right? Was this justice or vengeance? Was she doing this for Preston or for herself? But then she'd remember Clarissa's voice. He chose someone appropriate. She'd remember Garrett's laugh. The diversity experiment is over. She'd remember every microaggression, every moment she'd been made to feel less than, every time she'd been reduced to a checkbox in someone else's journey of self-discovery. And she'd remember Preston Hayes in that coffee shop, holding evidence of his stolen life with shaking hands. This wasn't about revenge. This was about accountability. This was about doing what Garrett had been too comfortable, too privileged, too cowardly to do. This was about making things right. The article went live on a Wednesday morning at 6 a.m. Eastern Time. The headline was simple, devastating, impossible to ignore. Lancaster Technologies built on stolen innovation. Original Black inventor finally gets recognition after 30 years. Within an hour, Sienna's phone started ringing. Within 2 hours, the story was trending on social media. Within 3 hours, Lancaster Technologies stock was in freefall. And within 4 hours, Garrett Lancaster called her, his voice shaking with a fury she'd never heard before. "How could you?" he demanded, not even bothering with hello. "After everything we shared, after I trusted you with that information, how could you do this to me?" Sienna took a breath, feeling calmer than she'd felt in months. "After everything we shared?" she repeated, her voice like steel wrapped in silk. "You reduced me to an experiment, Garrett. You let your fiancé call me a diversity checkbox while you stood there and said nothing. You mocked what we had while building your perfect life on lies, including the lies your family built their fortune on. I trusted you, and I kept your secret." Sienna cut him off. "I kept it through our breakup, through your engagement announcement, through watching you parade Clarissa around like an upgrade. I kept it until you showed me that you don't deserve that loyalty. But this isn't about you and me. This is about Preston Hayes getting justice 30 years too late. This is about doing what you were always too comfortable, too scared, too selfish to do yourself. You've destroyed everything." His voice cracked, and for a moment she heard the man she'd loved beneath the anger. "My company, my reputation, my wedding." "No," Sienna said quietly, and in that moment she felt the last piece of her heart that had belonged to him finally let go. "I've revealed the truth. There's a difference. You had every opportunity to make this right. You told me you wanted to, but you were too busy protecting your comfort, your image, your perfect white wedding to a woman your board approves of." The silence on the other end was deafening. "This is revenge," Garrett finally said. "This," Sienna corrected, "is accountability. Something you've never had to face in your entire privileged life. I loved you, Garrett. I would have built a life with you, had children with you, stood beside you through anything. But you chose comfort over courage. You chose appearances over authenticity. And you didn't just leave me. You disrespected me, humiliated me, tried to erase what we had like it meant nothing. She paused, feeling the weight of what came next. In doing so, you showed me exactly who you are. And you showed me that some secrets aren't meant to be kept. Not when keeping them means injustice continues. Not when staying silent makes you complicit in someone else's pain. She hung up before he could respond. And for the first time in months, Sienna Blackwell felt like she could breathe. But the real question, the question that would determine everything that came next, was this. When you choose truth over loyalty, when you burn down someone's empire to lift up someone else's justice, what rises from the ashes? And could Sienna live with the answer, whatever it turned out to be? What rises from the ashes when you choose truth over loyalty? Sienna was about to find out, and the answer would reshape not just her life, but the lives of everyone touched by the Lancaster legacy. The fallout from the exposé was nothing short of seismic. Within 24 hours, every major news outlet had picked up the story. Tech dynasty built on theft screamed the headlines. Black inventor robbed of billions finally vindicated, declared the industry publications. Social media erupted in a firestorm of outrage, with hashtags like #Justice for Preston Hayes and #LancasterLies trending worldwide. The business world that had once celebrated Garrett Lancaster as a visionary leader now scrutinized every decision he'd ever made, every innovation his company had ever claimed. Lancaster Technologies stock didn't just drop, it plummeted. 43% in the first week alone. Shareholders demanded answers. Board members called emergency meetings. And the SEC announced an investigation into the company's founding documents and patent claims, looking for evidence of fraud that stretched back 3 decades. But here's what the headlines couldn't capture, what the stock tickers and board meetings couldn't quantify: the human cost of truth finally spoken. Garrett's wedding to Clarissa Worthington was postponed indefinitely. Not canceled, mind you, postponed, that careful word that wealthy people use when they want to maintain appearances while their world crumbles. Clarissa's family, those pillars of banking society who'd been so eager to merge their legacy with the Lancasters, suddenly found reasons to distance themselves. Statements about needing time to process this revelation and supporting a thorough investigation appeared in carefully worded press releases that said everything by saying nothing at all. The Lancaster Technologies board, those same men who'd whispered about Sienna being a distraction, who'd questioned her influence on Garrett's decisions, who'd made it clear she wasn't appropriate for their CEO, forced Garrett to step down temporarily while investigations proceeded. Temporarily. Another careful word that masked a brutal reality. The golden boy had fallen, and they needed someone to blame. Constance Lancaster, the woman who'd told her son that marrying Sienna would be a liability, found herself facing questions she'd never had to answer before. How much had she known about her husband's theft? Had she been complicit in erasing Preston Hayes from history? The society pages that had once fawned over her charity galas now scrutinized every donation, wondering if the Lancaster family philanthropy was just gilt money wrapped in tax deductions. But beyond the corporate chaos and family drama, something more important was happening. Something that made every moment of Sienna's doubt, every sleepless night questioning her decision, every fear about whether she'd done the right thing, it made all of it worth it. Preston Hayes was finally getting justice. The lawsuit that followed the exposé was swift and devastating. Lancaster Technologies, facing mountains of evidence and a public relations nightmare they couldn't spin their way out of, settled within 3 months. The exact amount was never publicly disclosed, sealed by legal agreements and non-disclosure clauses. But sources close to the negotiations suggested it was substantial enough to make Preston Hayes a wealthy man. Wealthy enough to finally receive a fraction of what his innovations had been worth. More important than the money was the vindication. Preston Hayes' name was added retroactively to the original patents. Press conferences were held where he stood beside his lawyers, no longer the nobody fighting the billionaire empire, but a recognized innovator finally getting his due. Tech publications ran features about his story, and his face appeared on the covers of magazines that had once only shown the Lancasters. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when Preston and Sienna stood together at the launch of their new foundation, Truth and Innovation. a nonprofit dedicated to supporting Black tech innovators who'd been shut out of funding, recognition, and opportunity. The foundation's mission statement was simple but revolutionary, ensuring that genius is recognized regardless of who has the power to steal it. "This isn't just about what was taken from me," Preston said at the launch event, his voice steady and strong in a way that suggested decades of buried pain finally finding release. "This is about the hundreds, maybe thousands of Black innovators whose ideas were stolen, whose contributions were erased, whose names don't appear in the history books. This is about making sure it doesn't keep happening." Sienna stood beside him, and in that moment she understood something profound. This had never been about revenge against Garrett. It had been about using her platform, her resources, her privilege as someone who'd been inside the Lancaster world, to correct an injustice that should never have lasted 30 years. The question that had haunted her, was this right? Finally had its answer. Yes. 1,000 times yes. Meanwhile, Sienna's own life was transforming in ways she couldn't have predicted. Her consulting firm didn't just survive the controversy of being connected to the biggest corporate scandal in Chicago. It thrived. Companies that had been paying lip service to diversity and inclusion suddenly wanted to work with the woman who'd exposed one of the tech industry's darkest secrets. Her client list exploded. Speaking invitations poured in. She became a voice not just for corporate ethics, but for the courage it takes to speak truth to power, even when that power once held your heart. But success, Sienna was learning, isn't just about business growth or public recognition. Real success is measured in the quiet moments when you look in the mirror and respect the person looking back. And there was one more piece of her life that needed transformation, the part that Garrett had damaged but not destroyed, the part that still believed in love, even after being reduced to an experiment. His name was Darius Mitchell, and he entered Sienna's life without fanfare or dramatic timing, just a chance meeting at a legal conference where he was keynoting about civil rights law, and she was speaking on corporate accountability. He was a civil rights attorney who'd built his career defending the people who couldn't defend themselves, fighting battles against systems designed to crush them. Tall, with deep brown skin and eyes that held both wisdom and warmth, he had the kind of presence that didn't demand attention but earned it naturally. Their first conversation happened over coffee during a conference break, and it was startlingly different from that first conversation with Garrett all those years ago. There was no need to explain code switching, no tutorial required on microaggressions, no translation of cultural references. Darius understood her world because it was his world too. They spoke the same language, carried the same history in their bones, shared the same exhaustion and determination that comes from navigating a world that constantly questions your worth. "I read about what you did," Darius said, and Sienna braced herself for judgment. That took courage. Real courage. Most people talk about accountability. You actually demanded it. Their relationship grew slowly, carefully, with the kind of intentionality that comes from having been hurt before. Darius didn't love Sienna despite her boldness. He loved her because of it. He didn't ask her to shrink to fit his world because they were building a world together, one where she could be fully herself without apology or explanation. And here's what Sienna learned in the quiet moments with Darius. In the safety of being loved by someone who chose her publicly, proudly, without hesitation, love shouldn't require you to prove your worth. The right person doesn't make you feel like a liability or an experiment. They make you feel like home. But the story wasn't quite complete. Because in stories about accountability and justice, there's always a reckoning, a moment when the person who caused the pain has to face what they've lost. That moment came 18 months after the exposé dropped. Sienna was at an industry gala, not hiding, not avoiding, just existing in the professional world she'd earned her place in. She was there with Darius, stunning in a royal blue gown, her locks styled elegantly, her hand resting comfortably in the crook of his arm. Across the room, she saw Garrett. He looked older somehow, the easy confidence replaced with something harder, more uncertain. He'd married Clarissa in a quiet ceremony, nothing like the society wedding they'd originally planned. The marriage, according to industry gossip, was strained under the weight of scandal and scrutiny. He'd returned to Lancaster Technologies as CEO after the investigation concluded, but the company would never fully recover its reputation. Neither would he. Their eyes met across the crowded ballroom, and Sienna saw something in his gaze. Regret, loss, the recognition of what he'd destroyed with his own hands. A few minutes later, he approached. Clarissa was nowhere in sight. "Sienna," he said quietly, "can we talk? Just for a moment." Darius looked at her with a question in his eyes, and she squeezed his hand. "I'll be right back," she said, and he nodded, trusting her completely. She and Garrett stepped onto a balcony, not unlike the one where they'd first connected all those years ago. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. "I wanted to apologize," Garrett began, his voice carrying a vulnerability she hadn't heard since those intimate nights when he confessed his family's sins. "You were right about everything. I was a coward. I let my fear of what people thought, what my family expected, what the board wanted. I let all of it destroy the best thing I ever had. And then I was cruel to you. I let Clarissa say those things. I participated in mocking what we had when you deserved so much better." Sienna listened, her face calm, her heart no longer racing at his nearness. Time and healing had given her something precious: perspective. "I've thought a lot about what you did," Garrett continued, "exposing the truth about my father, about Preston Hayes. At first, I saw it as betrayal. But I understand now you did what I should have done years ago. You had the courage I lacked. And Preston, he deserved justice. He still does." "Yes," Sienna said simply. "He did." "Can you forgive me?" Garrett asked, and in his eyes she saw genuine remorse. "Not for us, I know there's no going back. But for you, so you can move forward without carrying anger." Sienna looked at this man who'd once held her heart, seeing him clearly without the filter of love or the distortion of pain. "I forgive you, Garrett," she said, and meant it. "Not for you, but for me. Because carrying anger only weighs me down, and I refuse to carry weight that doesn't serve my growth." "Thank you," he whispered. "But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting the lessons," Sienna continued, her voice gentle but firm. "You taught me that love requires courage, that comfort often costs us our integrity, that when we choose what's easy over what's right, we lose the best parts of ourselves. You loved me, Garrett. I believe that, but you loved your comfort more. That was your choice. These consequences are the price of that choice. Is there any chance?" he began, hope flickering in his eyes. "No," Sienna said, not unkindly. "There is no us. There can't be. Because I finally love myself too much to accept being someone's complicated. I deserve someone who's proud to stand beside me in every room, in every world, without hesitation. You weren't that person. Maybe someday you will be, for someone else. But not for me. Never again for me." She walked back inside, back to Darius, who looked at her with eyes full of love and pride, and she realized something profound. Closure isn't about the other person apologizing or understanding what they did wrong. Closure is about you finally understanding your own worth enough to walk away from anything less than you deserve. 2 years after the exposé that changed everything, Sienna stood in her new office overlooking downtown Chicago. Truth and innovation had grown beyond her wildest expectations, becoming a leading voice in ethical business practices and a lifeline for underrepresented innovators. The walls were decorated with photos of the hundreds of entrepreneurs they'd helped, Preston Hayes prominent among them, his smile wide and genuine in a way that spoke of justice finally served. She had Darius, whose love was steady and public and proud. She had her business, built on integrity and courage. She had Preston's friendship and the knowledge that she'd helped right a 30-year-old wrong. She had the respect of her industry and, more importantly, her own self-respect. Sometimes she still saw Garrett at events. He'd look at her with something like longing, but she'd simply nod politely and turn back to conversations that mattered, to people who valued her, to a life she'd built on her own terms. Because the ultimate lesson, the one that took heartbreak and courage and truth-telling to learn, was this: the right person won't make you feel like you need to shrink to fit their world. They'll expand their world to celebrate all of who you are. They'll choose you when it's hard, not just when it's easy. And they'll have the courage to stand for truth, even when lies are more comfortable. Sienna had exposed more than Garrett's secret. She'd revealed a larger truth about integrity, justice, and the price of staying silent when speaking up could set things right. And in doing so, she'd freed herself to live authentically, love fully, and build a legacy far more meaningful than anything the Lancasters could ever claim. Because real success, the kind that matters, the kind that lasts, isn't measured in wealth or status or who approves of your choices. It's measured in whether you can look at yourself in the mirror and respect the person looking back. Sienna could, and that made her richer than any billionaire who'd chosen comfort over character could ever be. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to choose between loyalty and truth? Between keeping someone's secret and doing what's right? Have you ever loved someone who loved you in private but couldn't claim you in public? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because your story matters just as much as Sienna's. And if this story resonated with you, if it made you think about courage and integrity and the price of staying silent, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. We're building a community of people who believe that truth matters more than comfort, that justice is worth fighting for, and that your worth isn't determined by who chooses or rejects you. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, someone who's struggling with whether to speak their truth, someone who's been made to feel small by someone who claimed to love them, someone who needs to be reminded that they deserve to be chosen publicly, proudly, without apology. Drop a comment with the biggest lesson you took from Sienna's journey. Was it about the courage to expose truth? The importance of choosing yourself? The power of doing what's right even when it costs you everything? I read every single comment, and your insights help shape the stories we tell next. And remember, you carry generations of strength in your bones. Don't ever let anyone make you feel small. The right people will celebrate every part of who you are. The right love will choose you when it's hard, not just when it's easy. And sometimes, the most courageous thing you can do is tell the truth, even when silence would be more comfortable. Until next time, keep choosing courage over comfort, truth over convenience, and integrity over everything else. Because that's how you build a life you can be proud of. That's how you become rich in the ways that actually matter.